So many years ago, when I was still a student in college, I did some things that I now regret. And one of those things was that I used to smoke cigarettes. And for a few years, I really enjoyed smoking, and I was quite addicted to smoking. And there came a time when I decided that I wanted to quit. And so going ahead and quitting, it was very much one of the most difficult things that I've ever done, and one of the most painful things that I've ever done. And for a few months after quitting, my mind fell into a very dark place, and it was a place of incredible craving and desire and real misery. And I really felt during that time like I would never be happy again, and I really felt like it was impossible to be happy if I wasn't able to smoke cigarettes. But after a very long time, a period of several months, eventually that darkness lifted from the mind, and I was able to be at ease again. And now, many years later, I haven't thought of smoking for a very long time. Many years. I haven't desired to smoke a cigarette for many years. And if I see someone smoking now, I don't feel any desire at all for that. It's just something which is just totally a neutral object to me now. And the thought that you can't be happy without cigarettes, now it seems like a ridiculous thought. But it wasn't so ridiculous back then. It seemed very real. Now, looking back, I can see that what my desire told me, now it's very clearly seen as something which is not true. It was a lie that my craving told me, that my desire told me. And this is actually one of the lies that desire is telling all of us. All of the objects that we desire, we always feel like we can't be happy unless we have that object. And it really seems very real and very true. But, actually the real truth is that if we're willing to work through that desire, there will come a time in the future when that desire passes away, and then we have no more interest in that object. That object will become like just some kind of neutral object to us, and the feeling that that object is something incredibly special and important, is just a trick of our desire. It's just a lie that our desire tells us. So I tell this story because, I feel like it's a very good example of, a time in which my craving, my desire, told me something which seemed very real, and yet now many years later I can see that it's a lie. But this is only one of the many lies that our desire tells us, that our craving tells us. Another one of the lies that our craving tells us is that if we just get the object of our desire, then that will bring us real happiness. So we see pleasure in the world, but we don't see any pain or any kind of negative aspect to enjoyment, enjoying sensuality, enjoying the objects of the senses. We don't tend to see any kind of negative aspect to that. And the reality is that, all of the things that we enjoy in the world, when we take delight in things, we're also getting something else in addition to that pleasure. And it's something that tends to be hidden, that we tend to not really see until later. And that, of course, is the the suffering, the longing, the desire, the craving that arises when we no longer have that object. So the Buddha taught, in many different similes and many different ways about sensuality, about the objects and experiences that we enjoy in the world. And, one of the similes that he used was like delicious tasting poison. It's like a drink that is delicious, but it has poison in it. And we tend to see the pleasant experience, but we don't really a lot of times realize later when the suffering arises, when the poisonous effect arises, we don't really necessarily tend to see where that comes from. But very much like the delicious poison, the experience of pleasure tends to be very short-lived, and the experience of suffering is something that stretches very far into the future. And, when I quit smoking, all of that suffering, all of the darkness that arose, if I ask where did that come from, it's really a direct result of all of the enjoyment that I had taken in smoking before that time. So, having enjoyed something, then in the future, when we no longer have that, we have to experience craving and longing for it. I didn't really think of that at the time when I was enjoying myself smoking. I didn't think that I would have to experience real misery in the future. But that's the unfortunate reality of delighting in anything in the world, is that it always has that other aspect of longing that must arise in the future when we no longer have it. And it's very much like we can consider if we have very strong craving for something like a durian fruit, is it possible to crave a durian if we've never tasted it before? Of course it isn't really possible. That longing and craving, it comes from having delighted in it in the past, and to whatever extent we've delighted in it, then to that extent we will suffer in the future when it's gone. So this is, also another unfortunate reality of sensuality, and another one of the lies that our craving tells us. Craving tells us that there's only pleasure, in sensuality, in the objects that we desire. There's only pleasure there. The more you have, the more happy you'll be. That's what our desire tends to tell us. If you just have a lot of money, if you just have a lot of the things you desire, then you'll have a lot of happiness. But, actually the reality is that the more we have over time, the more longing and desire is created in the mind. And this is very much why, as people get older, they tend to be more and more unhappy. They tend to have more and more discontent, and it's just a natural result of having lived our whole lives chasing after the attractive, delightful, pleasant things of the world. At some point it all comes back to torture us, really. Just like my story of quitting smoking, in the end, when you at some point you lose those things, it will come back to haunt us in the end. And so this is another one of the lies that our desire tells us about the things that we desire in the world. And another one of the many lies that our craving tells us is that if we just get the object of our desire, then it will make us happy forever. And we really do believe that. It does really seem very real. We tend to perceive the world, objects in the world, as being very permanent. But the reality, I think, that we've all experienced, is that the objects of the world that we enjoy and delight in, they're very much like, it's very much like watching a movie. You might find the best movie in the world, the movie that you're the most interested in. And, when you watch the movie, you would experience a lot of pleasure. But, as soon as that movie is over, after a few hours, you can never again watch that movie and experience that same amount of pleasure again. You can only experience a very small fraction of that pleasure again. And if we had thought in the beginning that that movie was going to make us happy forever, that's just not true. The unfortunate reality of our mind is that we just get bored with things. And that is, that's a manifestation of impermanence. The Buddha is telling us that everything is impermanent, but we don't really, truly understand what that means. It means that not only the objects that we enjoy are impermanent, but the way that it makes us feel is impermanent. So something that we enjoy today, we don't necessarily enjoy it as much the next day. It's totally uncertain, it's totally unreliable, and this is why the Buddha said, we live our whole lives always seeking fresh delight. And this is one of the definitions of craving, is always ever seeking fresh delight. So, there's really, whatever object we find that we delight in, we can never really grab that happiness, that pleasure. We can never really keep it. It's always slipping through our fingers, like trying to grab water or something. It just slips through our fingers. So this is another one of the many lies that our craving tells us that seems, so convincing, so real. And somehow, even though we kind of see this in a way, but we just keep falling for it, over and over again. And, reflecting in this way, reflecting on the different things that our mind tells us about the world. This is the development of wisdom, the development of insight, really to question what our mind tells us about the things that we desire, the things that we have aversion towards, really questioning whether it's really true what our mind tells us. And one of the great stories about Ajahn Chah, he said if the fastest way to enlightenment was to point at your mind and say, liar. So it's very much with the things that we desire, the things that we have anger and aversion towards, the things that we're afraid of, really basically everything that our mind is telling us is something that should be questioned, and especially if it's something that leads to suffering. And when we really, reflect on it, we'll see that delighting in the objects of the world, ultimately it is like the Buddha said, the Buddha said that, one who delights in sensuality, their sorrow swells like the grass after the rain. And we see that here, when it starts to rain very heavily, suddenly the grass grows very, very fast and becomes very green. So the eventual result of delighting in the objects of the world is longing, desire, craving, discontent, unhappiness, the suffering. And I think it's also it's useful to reflect not only on the negative aspects of sensuality, but then to reflect on the path that the Buddha pointed out to us. The Buddha taught a path that also leads to happiness, but it's very much like a road that travels in the opposite direction of sensuality. And it's a path that he assures us actually leads to real happiness. The path of sila, samadhi, and panya, learning how to develop the mind through meditation to experience real peace and real happiness in our meditation. And I think it's very useful to contemplate the people who have lived both of those lives, or people who have walked both of those paths, to compare, how happy are people who have lived a life of sensuality, how happy are people who have lived a life of cultivating happiness and meditation. And, in considering the world of sensuality, one of the particularly, the kind of groups of people who maybe are at the forefront of the pleasure of the world, people who win the lottery. So you can imagine for many people, this is their dream to win a huge, hundreds of millions of dollar lottery. And, we really feel like if I could just win that lottery, then I would be truly happy. If we had hundreds of millions of dollars, we could never have to work again. We could buy whatever we want, and we could go wherever we want to go. So it really seems like, for somebody who believes in sensuality and sensual happiness, it really seems like that would be the ultimate, that would be the highest happiness. But it's quite fascinating that there have been studies that have been done about lottery winners. And actually, the people who win the lottery, they're not actually any happier than the average person over the long run. Like after the first year or something, it's quite fascinating, because that's really not not what we would think. But it's after we reflect on the nature of sensuality, of course, it makes sense, because ultimately in the long run, the more sensual pleasure we have, like we've been saying, in the long run, just the more discontent we have, the more longing we have. And, we can also reflect then on those great, spiritual masters who have devoted their life to meditation and have really, accomplished great things in their practice. There are many, many stories, but one of my favorite stories about the great Chan Master Shuyun, and there are many great stories of his life, but there's this one story where he was living in a cave and practicing meditation, and he's kind of the opposite of a sensualist. He had basically nothing in his cave, not really any possessions, no wealth, just living in his cave. And one day he just decided to cook some rice, and so he put the rice on the fire, and he went to wait for the rice to cook. And so he just sat in meditation for a few minutes, and his mind was so profoundly happy from all of the years of meditative development that he had worked for, that at that time his mind dropped into a very incredibly peaceful state of meditation. And meanwhile, his friends nearby, they realized they hadn't seen him in a really long time, so they decided to go check on him. And they went up into his cave, and they saw him sitting in meditation, and they walked up to him, and they held a little bell up to his ear and just rang it very softly so that he would come out of meditation. And he came out of his meditative state, and to him it seemed like he had just only been sitting there for a few minutes. So he said, "Oh, the rice should be done now." And so he got up and walked over to the rice and took the lid off, and the rice was just covered in mold. And it turns out that he had actually been sitting there for like 2 weeks or something, and didn't even actually realize it. These kinds of stories are quite amazing. This is the kind of happiness which is possible for someone who really walks the path of the Buddha, to a very deep level. They can experience states of happiness in which they're so incredibly content and peaceful that they're not even interested in eating anymore. That's not something that, even a lottery winner could experience. Even if you win the lottery, you're not going to be so happy that you just lose interest in eating or drinking. So these are just a few stories to contemplate. And the more that we consider these two paths, the more we'll realize that this path that the the Buddha has given us. It is the real path to happiness. So these are just a few reflections for this evening. Offer that.